My name is Margaret Collins, and I'm 68 years old. The day my husband, Henry, passed away, it rained for an entire week, a gray, heavy rain, as if the sky itself was mourning. Yet no storm could ever weigh as much as the moment I sat in attorney Clara Monroe's office, listening to the reading of Henry's will. Clara opened a thick file, her voice steady and professional, not a trace of emotion. To my eldest son, Ethan Collins, I leave the entire Collins & Stone construction company, valued at approximately $15 million. I looked at Ethan. He smiled like he'd just won the lottery. To my younger son, Lucas Collins, I leave our family restaurant chain, along with the remaining assets worth around $10 million. Lucas leaned back in his chair, a satisfied grin on his face. And me, I waited. My heart pounded so loudly I could hear it in my ears. And to my wife, Margaret, who has stood by me for 45 years, Clara paused for a brief second. I leave this envelope. She handed me a brown envelope, old and dusty, like something forgotten in a drawer. Olivia, Ethan's wife, let out a sarcastic laugh. Well, at least she's got something to press flowers in, huh? The room went silent. Ethan didn't look up. Lucas sighed, as if my very existence was a burden. 45 years of being a wife, a mother, and I was left with an envelope that looked like trash. I stood up, keeping my back straight, even as my heart splintered. No one walked me to the door. No one asked if I was all right. If you believe every mother deserves respect, hit subscribe to this channel. Here we share stories of family, forgiveness, and the strength of women who dare to rise after being broken. I left the building with that envelope in my hand. The rain slapped against my face, cold, but not as cold as people's hearts. On the way home, I couldn't remember whether the traffic lights were red or green. All I saw were my trembling hands clutching the only inheritance Henry had left me. The envelope was so light, I almost thought there was nothing inside. Maybe, I told myself, it's just a silly letter, or a goodbye note. I arrived home at the mansion where I had lived my entire life. The walls were silent. Henry's favorite chair sat empty. I placed the envelope on the table and stared at it for a long time. Under the warm yellow light, the old paper looked mottled, like my own skin, wrinkled, weary, and forgotten. Images flooded my mind. The nights I stayed up with Henry, watching him calculate expenses. The years I raised our 2 sons alone, selling my mother's wedding ring so he could start his company. The cold mornings when I woke early to make his coffee, waiting for him to return from the construction site. And now, all those years, all that love, compressed into a single dusty envelope. I sat for hours listening to the rain tapping against the window. Maybe, if I didn't open it, I could still imagine that Henry hadn't betrayed me. But curiosity, or was it despair, won. I picked up the envelope and gently peeled away the brittle glue. A single sheet of paper fell out, light as a breath. Henry's familiar handwriting appeared before my eyes. My hands trembled as I read the first line, and everything inside me stopped. I sat motionless in the old armchair, the paper trembling in my hand as if it had a soul of its own. Henry's handwriting choked me up. It carried me back to a time I thought I had forgotten. The years that began with nothing but love, faith, and a simple dream to build an honest life with our own hands. When Henry and I got married, we had nothing but a tiny rented room on the outskirts of Chicago, barely bigger than a matchbox. Henry worked as a construction laborer and I was a cashier at a small grocery store. In the evenings, he'd come home late, his hands still covered in cement dust. I would make him a cup of black coffee and he would talk about his dream of owning his own construction company someday. We had nothing but resilience and belief in each other. I still remember the day he went to the bank to apply for a loan. They laughed and said, "A construction worker and a cashier? What can you offer as collateral?" I didn't cry. I quietly took off the wedding ring my mother had left me and sold it so Henry could make his first deposit. That was the first time I understood that loving someone isn't just about sharing happiness, it's about sharing risk. In the following years, Henry worked tirelessly. He would be away on job sites for months at a time while I stayed home with our two small boys, Ethan and Lucas. I learned to do everything: change light bulbs, fix leaky pipes, manage accounts, and still help the kids with their homework. When Henry called, he always said, "We're almost there. Just hold on a little longer." And I believed him. I always did. Eventually, the company truly took off. Henry opened an office, hired staff, and signed his first contract with the city. We moved into a 2-story house, the kind I used to only dream about. I thought that after all those years of hardship, we could finally rest. However, it turned out that when the money arrived, everything else began to change as well. Ethan, our eldest son, was only 21, but already wanted a luxury car in his own house. Lucas dropped out of college, saying that school didn't teach people how to get rich. I watched my sons and tried to teach them decency and humility, but my words seemed to pass through them like the wind. Henry always defended them. "They're young, don't be so hard on them." I stayed silent, not wanting to argue, but deep down, I knew they were growing up differently from how we once lived. As the years passed, Henry became increasingly busy. Sometimes he didn't have a single dinner at home all week. He talked about partners, projects, and profits. I listened, nodded, made coffee, and cleared the table. It was as if I had become a familiar shadow, unnoticed, yet always expected to be there. Still, I believed that when we grew old, he would take my hand and say, "Don't worry. I've made sure you'll never suffer." That belief was what made the shock in the lawyer's office this morning unbearable. I couldn't understand how the man who once promised to love me forever could leave me with nothing but a dusty envelope. After 45 years, how could the only thing left for me be emptiness? I looked down at the paper again, my hands trembling slightly. If Henry truly left me something in this envelope, it probably wasn't money. Perhaps it was a message, a final message I hadn't yet found the courage to read to the end. But then I took a deep breath and wiped away my tears. I knew that whatever was inside, it would change everything, and I needed to know. That night, the house was wrapped in a terrifying silence. The old clock in the living room kept ticking. Tick-tock, as if reminding me that time still moved on, even when the heart refused to. On the table, the brown envelope lay still, as though waiting for me to gather the courage to touch it. I'd been staring at it for hours. Part of me wanted to throw it away, the way people discard painful memories. But another part, stronger and more desperate, wanted to know why Henry had left me in such humiliation. I slowly opened the flap, careful as if whatever was inside might vanish with a single breath. A folded sheet of paper, old and yellowed, slipped onto the table. It was Henry's handwriting. I recognized it instantly. Each letter slanted slightly, firm and deliberate, just like the birthday notes he used to write me. But this time, there were no words of love. Only one simple line. For the only woman who always believed in me. You deserve to know the truth. Account number 8842CH at Zurich Private Trust Bank. The security code is kept in custody by attorney Clara Monroe. I read it again and again. Zurich, Switzerland, an international bank. Henry had never mentioned anything like this, not in any report, plan, or conversation we ever shared. My heart pounded. Something felt strange. Henry had never hidden things from me. Not until he was gone. I grabbed my phone, searched for Zurich's international code, and dialed the bank. The operator's voice came through, calm and professional. "Hello, this is Margaret Collins, wife of the late Henry Collins. I've been authorized by him to inquire about account number 8842CH. There was a brief silence. Then the woman said, "Mrs. Collins, to proceed, will need the security code provided to the legal beneficiary." I froze. The security code. Henry had mentioned it in the note. It was kept with Clara Monroe, the very lawyer who read the will this morning. I was about to hang up when the woman continued. If you are indeed the authorized beneficiary, we can send formal confirmation to your attorney. May I have her name and office address? I gave her Clara's information. The woman verified it, her tone lowering slightly before saying, according to our records, the sole beneficiary is Mrs. Margaret Collins. The current account balance is $90 million US. I went numb. The phone slipped from my hand and hit the wooden floor. $90 million. I picked the phone back up, trembling. I'm sorry. How much did you say? $90 million, ma'am. There is also a separate deposit that can only be opened in your presence, together with Attorney Monroe. A confirmation letter will be sent today. I didn't hear the rest. The world around me seemed to dissolve into silence. I sat there, one hand over my mouth, tears spilling uncontrollably. Henry, what have you done? In the will, he had left our sons $25 million. And me, the woman he let their scorn fall upon. He made the secret owner of $90 million. I didn't know whether to feel joy or fury. Part of me wanted to believe it was Henry's way of protecting me, but another part, deeper and heavier, couldn't stop wondering. Why did he keep this from me all those years? I looked around the room. Everything bore Henry's mark. Our wedding photo, the clock on the wall, his old coffee cup on the desk. How could someone live beside me for nearly half a century and still keep such secrets? Then another chime, an email notification. It was a message from Zurich. Dear Mrs. Collins, as requested, account 8842CH is now confirmed as your legal property. Details and access instructions are enclosed in a sealed envelope sent to Attorney Clara Monroe's office. I placed a hand over my chest, feeling my heart pound painfully. Henry had left me a fortune, and yet also a question without an answer. Why hide it? Why make it so complicated? And most of all, why tell me I deserve to know the truth? I looked again at his handwriting. The letters seemed to whisper in the dark. You'll understand when the time comes. I folded the paper carefully, put it in the drawer, and leaned back in the chair. Outside, the rain kept falling. But inside me, another storm was rising. A storm named truth. One I wasn't yet ready to face. 3 days after the call with the Zurich Bank, I received an unexpected call from the Central Post Office. Mrs. Collins, we have an international parcel addressed to you from Mr. Henry Collins. According to our records, you are the sole authorized recipient. I froze. Henry had sent me something else? My heart raced, thundering in my chest. I drove through the drizzle, caught between fear and hope. The clerk handed me a small silver metal box, tightly sealed, labeled personal property, to be opened only in the presence of Margaret Collins. Back home, I placed the box on the table and stared at it for a long time. My hands trembled slightly as I undid the latch. Inside were things I never expected. A thick stack of documents bound with a red string, a small black hard drive, and a handwritten letter. Henry's handwriting, steady, precise, unmistakable. I opened the letter. Margaret, if you're reading this, it means I'm no longer here. I know the reading of the will must have hurt you, but I needed that to happen. I needed you to see the true faces of those you still call family. I stopped reading, breath catching in my throat. The letter slipped from my hand, but I quickly picked it up again. I had to know the rest. 2 years ago, I discovered that Ethan had secretly withdrawn money from the company to pay off his gambling debts. I hired a private auditor. They discovered over $2 million embezzled through shell accounts. When I confronted him, he cried, begged for forgiveness, and promised to change. I believed him, Margaret. I was a fool. Because months later, I found out Lucas was involved in something far worse. My fingers dug into the edge of the table. Lucas was addicted to cocaine. He sold 3 of his properties for cash. Worse, he was being blackmailed by a criminal group to launder money through our restaurant chain. When he couldn't pay, they threatened his life. I paid off his debt once, secretly, because I didn't want you to worry. But I knew, once I was gone, they would come back. And I feared they would come for you. I had to stop reading to catch my breath. The words blurred through my tears. I couldn't believe it. The sons I had raised, loved, and sacrificed for had become strangers. I turned to the next page. The worst part, Margaret, wasn't their mistakes. It was that night, lying in my hospital bed, when I overheard them talking in my office. A chill ran down my spine. I glanced at the hard drive on the table. Some part of me already knew what it contained. I heard Ethan tell Lucas, "When the old man dies, make sure we deal with Mom before she claims control." Then Olivia, our daughter-in-law, suggested hiring a lawyer to declare you mentally unfit. They planned to place you in Evergreen Haven retirement home, the one they already put a deposit on. I covered my mouth to stop a cry. Evergreen Haven, I knew that place. A luxury home where the elderly were cared for until they quietly disappeared from their families' lives. Henry's following words made my hands shake. I recorded that conversation. It's on the hard drive. I hired detectives who gathered evidence of everything they'd done in my final 2 years. Once I knew the full truth, I created a secret parent company, Collins Holding, and transferred all corporate shares into it under your name as the sole legal owner. The inheritance they think they're fighting over, the $25 million, was just a facade, a decoy I left for them to see. Tears streamed down my face. Henry, the man I thought had abandoned me, had been protecting me all along, playing a silent game of chess in the shadows. I knew I didn't have much time. The cancer was eating away at me. But every day I saw you caring for me, I had one more reason to finish what I started. When I was gone, I didn't want you to be a woman in need of protection. I wanted you to become a woman who could protect herself. In the box are the power of attorney, contracts, and ownership proofs. Find Clara Monroe. She's the only one who knows everything. And finally, Margaret. If you're angry at me for making you suffer, please understand, I did it so you could see who your true enemies are. I lowered the letter, my whole body trembling. On the table, the stack of documents looked like evidence in a criminal case. I plugged in the hard drive. A single audio file appeared, dated 3 weeks before Henry's death. I pressed play. Ethan's voice was clear. "If Mom signs the property transfer, we'll have full control. Olivia, make sure the fake doctor's ready." Olivia's voice followed. "He's already agreed. $5,000 to certify she's showing signs of dementia." Then Lucas, his tone shaky but complicit. "Do it fast. I need the cash to pay off my suppliers by the end of the month." The world spun around me. Then Henry's voice came through, hoarse, weak, but unmistakable. How could you talk about your mother like that?" There was the sound of a door creaking open, startled voices, and then silence. I slammed the laptop shut and sank to the floor, both hands over my face. The pain was beyond words, not only because Henry had died knowing the truth, but because I had given birth to 2 men willing to sell their souls for money. I cried until dawn. But when the sun finally rose, the last tear dried, leaving behind only a cold, steady resolve. If Henry had sacrificed his strength, his peace, and even his name to protect me, I would not let that sacrifice be in vain. I would not let them lock me away in a nursing home. I would make them face everything they had done. I wiped my face, opened the drawer, and pulled out the note with the account number. Then I looked up at Henry's photo on the wall. "Henry," I whispered. "They chose the wrong woman to betray." The next morning, I called Clara Monroe, the lawyer who had read the will that day. Her voice was low and calm, but with a hint of hesitation when she heard my name. "Miss Clara," I said, "Henry left me some documents and the Zurich bank code. He said you knew everything." There was a brief silence on the other end. Then she replied simply, "Mrs. Collins, I think it's time you come to the office. There are things Mr. Henry instructed that will only be revealed if you come in person." I drove over. On the way, everything seemed blurred. Signs, passers-by, even time slowing down. Only one thought filled my head. Henry had arranged everything so I would take control. When I walked in, Clara stood to greet me and set a thick file. On the desk in front of me, its cover labeled, "Collins Holding, Confidential." She opened to the first page and pointed to the signature line. "According to the legal documents Mr. Henry arranged 2 years ago, you are the owner of 52% of the entire group's shares. Your 2 sons are only interim managers. Legally, the final decision-making authority rests entirely with you." I was stunned. My God, why didn't Henry tell me? Clara gave a sad smile. "He feared that if you knew too early, they might try to harm you." I was silent for a long time. Inside, the pain gradually gave way to another flame, the flame of determination. If Henry had set this game up, I would have played it to the end. In the days that followed, I took action. I hired an independent auditing firm to review the company's finances for the past 3 years. I contracted a private security company and arranged for rotating guards to be stationed around the house. I also asked Clara to prepare legal documents in case my children dared to move against me or the assets. I told no one. I kept silent and waited. I knew they would come, and I was ready. 3 days later, the doorbell rang. On the monitor, I saw Ethan, Olivia, and a middle-aged man in a white lab coat holding a leather briefcase. I opened the door, forcing a calm expression. "Hello, Mom." Ethan forced a smile. "We just wanted to make sure you're okay. This is Dr. Evans, a geriatric specialist. You know, at your age, it's good to have regular checkups." I looked into their eyes and smiled faintly. "Oh, you're so concerned about me?" Olivia cut in with saccharine sweetness. "Of course. It's dangerous for you to be alone like this. Dr. Evans just wants to do a few memory tests. Very simple." I invited them into the living room, set my phone on the table, and turned on the recorder. The doctor opened his case and took out a folder. "Mrs. Collins," he said, "I need to ask a few simple questions. Do you know what today's date is?" I chuckled softly. "Friday, October 13th. "Where do you live?" "At the house my husband and I built with our own hands, 74 Maple Avenue." I saw Olivia glance quickly at Ethan, signaling something. "One last question," the doctor said. "Do you know the total amount your husband left in the will?" That was the trap question. If I said I only received an envelope, they would mark symptoms of confusion. If I said 90 million, they would call me delusional. I smiled and looked him straight in the eye. I remember very clearly. My 2 sons share 25 million. I received an envelope they thought was trash. The doctor took notes and nodded. Ethan's smile became triumphant. "Mrs. Collins," he said, "in my assessment, you would benefit from resting a few days in an appropriate medical facility. We have an excellent place, Evergreen Haven." I froze. That name. The very place they had planned to lock me away. I stood slowly, my gaze as cold as ice. "Dr. Evans, are you really a doctor?" He fumbled. "Oh, of course, ma'am." I picked up my phone, switched the recorder to loud, and spoke clearly. "I want to record this as evidence. My son, Ethan Collins, my daughter-in-law, Olivia Collins, and a man claiming to be a doctor are attempting to coerce me into signing papers declaring me legally incompetent." Ethan stepped forward, his voice sharp. "Mom, don't make a fuss. You need help." I took a step back and hit the video button. "Help? How? By putting me in Evergreen Haven and stealing all my assets?" Olivia went pale. "Mom, you're misunderstanding." I cut her off. "Misunderstanding? Then what was the $5,000 he received from you for? The room fell silent. What did you say? The doctor stammered. I opened my phone and showed a photo, taken from the documents Henry left behind, of the doctor taking an envelope of cash from Ethan. He went white, dropping his briefcase. I was only hired to sign some papers. I didn't know it was illegal. Ethan froze. Olivia started to cry. I looked at each of them, my voice low but firm. Have you forgotten who I am? I am not some old doll for you to dispose of. I sold my mother's wedding ring so your father could start this company. Every brick and every ledger entry. And I still have enough sense to protect what your father left behind. Ethan snarled. You're tearing our family apart. I replied calmly. No, I'm saving it from rot. The doorbell rang. 2 police officers entered, accompanied by Clara Monroe. I looked Ethan squarely in the eye and said quietly, Henry guessed right. You would come, and he prepared everything. The officers asked the doctor for his medical license. He bowed his head and confessed everything. Ethan and Olivia stood motionless, the color drained from their faces. Clara came over and placed a hand on my shoulder. Everything was recorded, Mrs. Collins. Henry truly believed you were strong enough to get through this. I looked around the room, which had once held laughter but now held only silence and shame. I sighed and said softly, but so everyone could hear, from today on, I am no longer the betrayed one. I am the one who will teach you the meaning of consequences. After the day the police left the house, my mansion was unnaturally quiet. No more arguments, no more deceitful glances. Only the smell of cold coffee and a slight chill slipping through the door cracks. A reminder that everything had truly changed. I had everything in my hands: evidence, authority, justice. With just one signature, Ethan and Olivia would face charges of fraud and forgery. Attorney Clara said, If you wish, I can file the case first thing tomorrow. I sat quietly for a long time. Sunlight from the window fell on Henry's framed photo, his eyes as gentle as ever. I heard his voice in my head. I don't want you to become like them. You are strong, but don't let hatred tarnish the good in you. I set the pen down and folded the files. No, I told Clara. I don't want my children to go to prison. I want them to learn a lesson the law can't teach. 3 days later, I called Ethan, Lucas, and Olivia to the house. No police, no lawyers, just me, the old wooden table, and 3 bowed heads in silence. Ethan looked at me with dark, sleepless eyes. Lucas was noticeably thinner, his hands trembling, and Olivia avoided my gaze. I began in a calm voice. You've committed the worst thing a child can do to their mother, but we will not let the police teach you. Life will. I turned to Ethan. You are the eldest. You must take responsibility for the company your father built. From now on, you are no longer a director, but a site supervisor, paid like everyone else. You will work until you have repaid all the embezzled funds. Ethan looked up, his lips quivering. Mother, are you punishing me? I replied, No, I am teaching you how to start over. I turned to Lucas. You are different. I'm aware of your debts and the individuals with whom you're associated. Tomorrow, I will take you to the rehabilitation center I have sponsored. After that, you will work with the police to provide information to dismantle that criminal group, not to make amends to me, but to make amends to yourself. Lucas bowed his head and wept. I have disappointed Father, Mother. I looked at him, my voice choking. Your father believed you could change. Don't make him wrong. Finally, I looked at Olivia. She lifted her head, eyes equal parts terrified and defiant. You destroyed this family with your greed. I cannot forgive you, but I do not wish to hate you. From today, you are no longer a member of the Collins family. I have transferred all assets in your name into a legal trust, and you must leave this house permanently. Olivia was silent, lips trembling. Then she burst into tears and fell to her knees. I'm sorry. I was just afraid of being poor. I didn't want to live like before. I sighed softly. Ambition is not wrong, Olivia, but losing your humanity to get it is. You can find yourself again, just not here, not in this house. No one said anything more, only the sound of sobs and wind slipping through the curtains. I looked at the three of them, feeling both heavy and relieved in my chest. "Do you know?" I said, voice low but clear. "Money can buy a house, but it can never buy a home. A family is built on trust, and when trust is gone, no amount of money can rebuild it." I stood, walked to the door, and turned my back. "Go home. I need to be alone." Ethan bowed his head. Lucas helped Olivia out. Before they left, Ethan turned back, voice hoarse. "I'm sorry, Mother. I promised to change." The door closed. I sat down in my chair and looked out at the garden. It began to drizzle, as if Henry were somewhere, quietly watching over me. I didn't know if they would truly change, but for the first time in months, I felt at peace. Not because I had won, but because I had chosen not to let hatred win me. A year has passed since the day I opened that old envelope. Everything in my life, from the wounds to my silvered hairs, had changed. But the most significant change was not outward. It was within me. I, Margaret Collins, once seen as the dutiful wife and the betrayed old mother, am now the chairwoman of Collins Group, the company Henry and I built together from nothing. I no longer stand at the kitchen table making coffee while others make the decisions. I make the decisions. Every morning I walk into the boardroom with my silver hair tied neatly, wearing a simple gray suit and the pearl pin Henry gave me at the start of our marriage. Those who once dismissed me as the boss's wife now call me Mrs. Collins, the woman who saved the company. After stabilizing the company, I established the Golden Years Foundation, known as the Golden Years, an organization to support older women abandoned by family, whose assets were stolen by their children, or simply women who spent their lives caring for others and forgot to care for themselves. Whenever I enter the foundation's office, where silver-haired women learn computer skills and laugh over cups of tea, I remember myself a year ago, lonely, hurt, sitting under a lamp reading my husband's letter at night. I realized Henry was right. That envelope didn't just contain secrets and money, it also contained a threat. It contained an awakening. Ethan now works at the construction company, not in the office but out on the site. He wakes at 5 a.m., puts on a hard hat and work boots, sweat beading on his brow. Whenever he sees me at the company, he merely nods. No excuses, no demands. One lunchtime, I saw Ethan eating with the crew in the break area. He smiled and shared his boxed lunch with a younger worker, and I knew that was the first time I saw my son truly humble. Lucas is at the rehabilitation center I funded. He helps others recovering from addiction, those who once were as lost as he was. At one meeting, he said, "Mom, when I talk to them, I see myself. And for the first time, I don't feel ashamed. I feel grateful that you didn't abandon me." I said nothing, only took his hand. No more words were needed. Forgiveness is not forgetting. Forgiveness is choosing to believe someone can be better. The official launch of the Golden Years Foundation was held in the grand ballroom of the Metropolitan Hotel. Warm lights filled the room, reflecting off photos of the women helped by the foundation, their smiles bright, their strength evident. Many guests attended, business people, philanthropists, and those who had once thought, "Mrs. Collins is just an old housewife." Today they sat quietly, watching the woman they had underestimated, standing on the stage, holding a microphone, eyes steady with confidence. I began my speech. A year ago, I was a 69-year-old widow left, with a dusty envelope. But it turned out that envelope was not an ending. It was the beginning of the most beautiful chapter of my life. I learned that no one is too old to start again, and no child is too late to learn how to love. The hall erupted in long applause. I looked to the back row. Ethan sat there quietly. He did not go on stage or seek attention. He just sat, nodded, and wiped a tear with the sleeve of his dusty work shirt. For the first time in years, I saw pride in my son's eyes, not ambition. Lucas stood on the left of the hall, helping organize. When our eyes met, he smiled, a genuine smile, not a hidden one. That evening, back at home, I sat at my desk. The old envelope lay before me, now more faded than before. Inside was no longer the paper with the account number. Instead, there were letters of thanks from the women the foundation had helped. A 73-year-old woman wrote, "Thanks to your foundation, I was given back my youth, not in looks, but in faith." Another wrote, hands shaking, "Mrs. Margaret, thank you for showing me I still have worth, even when my children forget me." I smiled and smoothed the papers. The living room was quiet except for the soft wind and the clock's steady tick. I looked up at Henry's photo on the wall and whispered, "See, Henry, you left me an envelope, and I turned it into a whole new world." Moonlight filtered through the window and reflected on our wedding photo. Two young people smiling, hands clasped. I closed the journal on the desk, the last line written in steady handwriting. When you think you are at the end, it may be the first page of a new chapter. And that is my story. The story of a woman once forgotten, who learned to see herself before waiting for others to see her.